Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Tom Secker joins the show today as we compare and contrast two movies, War Machine and Charlie Wilson's War. We talk about Afghanistan, wars, history, geopolitics, movies, the involvement of the national security state in the entertainment industry, and more. It's a great in-depth conversation. It's both interesting and informative, both serious and lighthearted at varying times, and it's packaged into 2 episodes, published separately this week, or available in full in advance for patrons. Tom Secker is a writer, researcher, podcast host from Northern England. He specializes in the intelligence services, Hollywood, and the history of terrorism. He hosts the Clandestine podcast, and he's the author of 2 books, including National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. Find his work and ways to support that work at spyculture.com and patreon.com/Tom Secker. We recorded this on October 18th, 2018, and this is part 2. So with the War Machine, maybe this is a good time to play this clip. I've got 2 clips. Well, I'll just do the first one. But the first clip is, and thanks to Scott Horton, by the way, for allowing me to use these. It's April 21st, 2009. So this is a full year before the Runaway General article is written by Michael Hastings in the Rolling Stone. And I guess his book came out much long, January 2012. So it's about 2.5 years before that. I think it tells kind of a good story about his attitude toward the search. One of the things that angered him is that he felt that a lot of the generals or the high-level people, they understood that the search was a ruse, that it really wasn't going to work. He also had spent quite a bit of time on the ground, like embedded with some troops, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so, he certainly empathized with them, and he had some friends in there too. So this is April 29th with Scott Horton, and they're talking about how officers are skeptical of Obama's new strategy for Afghanistan and the COIN, the counterinsurgency policy that's being sold by Petraeus and some people around him.
What startled me was the absolute lack of debate about our Afghanistan policy. And this was even, I was there at the end of last year, but this was quite clear that, the Obama administration was going to institute one of the largest increase in troops we've seen since the invasion of Iraq. And really there was no debate going on about it. So I wanted to go over there and see what was really going on. And one of the things I found from talking to military officials and soldiers on the ground was there's a significant amount of skepticism for the course that we're taking in Afghanistan. And that even included, I spoke to one of the military planners involved in the planning of the Obama administration's new strategy. And he said to me, what you have to ask yourself, is it in our vital national interest to be there? And he left it as a question mark. And I said, well, do you think it is? He's like, I don't know. I'm telling them where they need the troops if they need the troops. Mm-hmm. Well, but I think we really have to ask ourselves that question.
This was the same guy that called what's going on now an existential presence.
It's actually a different. That's the thing that's even a different official.
And now these are civilian people in the Pentagon, or they're military officers, or generals, or colonels, or what?
Senior-ranking military officials, colonels and above.
The point is, they talk to you. They're as skeptical as the average grunt out there with the M16.
I think a lot of them are. The reality is this sort of counterinsurgency Kool-Aid that the officer corps has been drinking thanks to General Petraeus. There's been some pushback, and unfortunately, the guys who are pushing back aren't necessarily the people who are now calling the shots.
Indeed. Well, and in your article, you describe these troops out there, these fire bases, as they basically sound like Sisyphus out there pushing a boulder up a hill, and they know that all they're doing is just going through the motions. They're not doing anything really other than putting themselves at risk and putting other people at risk.
Sure, and of course, on a soldier by soldier basis, the political perspective ranges from people who believe that they should be there, people who want to be there, to people who are calling the mission into question. But certainly, the unit I was with, it was about 25 guys, had something like 350 square miles to cover, a good stretch of it along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. They're not even going to be able to see most of the area they're responsible for. And essentially, a lot of it is, as this is a familiar story, riding around and waiting until they get hit.
When you mentioned the Petraeus Kool-Aid about the counterinsurgency and all that, is that basically what, I guess you said, the skeptics are there, but they're not the ones calling the shots? The people calling the shots are basically, they want to do, just pretend to replicate the whole Anbar awakening somehow in Afghanistan, is that it?
That's basically the line. You go into these bases there, and they'll and the guys will have this sort of what do they call them? Inspirational quotes and whatnot up on the walls of their bases, and the big thing is this counterinsurgency. Separate the population from the enemy, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what gets missed in all this is that the counterinsurgency doctrine was sort of forced on the military in Iraq as the best strategy to fulfill a really bad policy, which was the invasion of Iraq. Now what's happened in Afghanistan, we've taken counterinsurgency. Oh, let's apply it to Afghanistan, a place that we were only supposed to go to get the bad guys and theoretically get out. So we've now decided to up our nation building significantly.
It is sort of just mission creep in a way. Like you said, there's no incentive to leave on the part, especially of the higher level officers or whatever. This is, each new fire base is more command and more power for them in their personal career.
So that's the first clip. And I guess I'm putting it in here for some context, to help understand what Michael Hastings' mindset was at the time, but also to show that he's been at this for a while. It wasn't sort of an opportunist thing where he was trying to, make a name for himself by taking down a general. I think he really did, he believed in this, and he was invested in this.
Oh, I agree. I mean, Michael Hastings was a pretty outstanding journalist in most respects. I don't think he was a chancer or an opportunist in anything that he did, really. And yeah, it's very interesting to hear him say that because there's the scene in the film itself, in War Machine, where Brad Pitt, he's effectively Stan McChrystal, is explaining this counterinsurgency strategy, this new way of thinking, new approach to Afghanistan. He's explaining it to a squad of Marines, and one of them is saying pretty much what Hastings is just quoting those higher up officials as saying, that they don't really understand how this is supposed to work. They don't see it being successful. They're not really sure how to prosecute and actually operate this on the ground. And I think that's very accurate. I mean, like you, I when I saw this film, I kind of spoke to a few people, and particularly one, an ex-Marine who was in Iraq while all of this coin stuff was going on. And I asked him, were you guys actually saying this to your higher ups? Were you actually saying this to their face that, this doesn't make any sense? We can't actually do this. How are we supposed to distinguish between the population and the insurgency? And he said, yeah, this is exactly what it was like. That the guys and women who were on the ground actually trying to do this, carry it out, had no real idea of how it was supposed to work. That it was more an intention than a plan, if you like. And that, I feel sorry for these people. I feel sorry for the Afghans and the Iraqis. We invaded their countries, but I also feel sorry for the poor sods who've actually had to go and try and fight these wars with no real sense of what it is they're supposed to be accomplishing or how. No wonder it's just ended up as such a mess.
Yeah, Hastings mentions that, not all the troops feel this way. There are some, in fact, he mentions a sort of specific category of, people who are there for the thrill of fighting wars.
Hmm.
But it's a significant, I mean, he doesn't try to portray, what I'm trying to say is like, he doesn't try to portray every,
Oh no,
every
no.
troop, as feeling this way. But it was significant enough that, you know, he brought it up. And they made it a very memorable scene in this movie where, which you talked about, where one of the troops, I guess it was a Marine, steps up, and I'd say it was close to insubordination. And
Yeah.
McChrystal reacts to it by saying, well, you just better figure out how to understand it. He he doesn't
No, sure, sure.
completely.
The Marine says, I guess I'm saying I'm confused, sir. And he basically just tells him, well, you better get yourself
Yeah,
unconfused.
yeah,
It's
I
like,
think that was the actual.
what kind of instruction is that? How is someone who's actually supposed to be fighting a war supposed to make any sense of that kind of an order? Really? Get yourself unconfused.
Yeah.
Spent the last week or so talking to guys who I would call middle management. But you boys are at the coal face. After all the blah, 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 you boys are where it actually happens. I'd go so far as to say, you boys are the only thing that counts. If it doesn't happen here, it doesn't happen. End of story. Yes, son.
If what doesn't happen, sir?
It, son.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Does anyone here know what it is? Anyone? Anyone?
To secure the area, sir. To protect the people from the enemy so they can go about building their lives.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Sergeant.
Okay, but I can't tell the difference between the people and the enemy. They all look alike to me. I'm pretty sure they're the same people, sir.
I understand it can be tough, son, but that's the job.
I have another question. I hear now they're giving out medals for heroic restraint. Do I have that right?
Courageous restraint. And that is right.
Well, I don't mean to be rude, sir, but I do not understand what the fuck that means.
It means, son, that sometimes when you're dealing with an insurgency, you're not going to be 100% clear on who the enemy is. It means you're going to find yourself in situations where, when you're afraid or whatnot, you're going to have to make a judgment call. Because as Sergeant Ortega here has so rightly pointed out, your mission is to protect the people, not kill them. We can't help them and kill them at the same time. It just ain't humanly possible. Do you understand me?
No, not really, sir. No.
What part are you struggling to comprehend, son?
I don't know, sir. It seems to me that we all here with our guns and shit, trying to convince these people that deep down, we're actually really nice guys. And I don't know how to do that, sir. I don't know how to do that when every second one of them, or every third one of them, or every 10th one of them is trying to fucking kill me, sir. Because I'm a Marine. Because we're Marines. And it seemed like now they're handing out medals for heroically not being a Marine, sir. I'm confused, is what I'm trying to say, sir.
Then you're just gonna have to get yourself unconfused, son.
And the truth of the matter is that going into this, Hastings knows that Stanley McChrystal is a smart man, and he knows, for a number of reasons, that he knows this surge, this whole COIN, that's the acronym COIN, this whole counterinsurgency nation building plan is not going to work. I mean, he doesn't really believe in it, and yet he's out there selling it with Petraeus, as well as Petraeus. It's sort of a desperate move because they're claiming that it sort of saved the war, and from our perspective, in Iraq, which it's questionable whether that surge and that coin strategy did save anything. That's a whole nother podcast. And he knows it's being used as a marketing, ploy because there was really no justification for keeping our troops in Afghanistan at this point, or Iraq, mind you. The Iraq War, we had a significant percentage of the public and officials, and I mean, it was pretty widespread. There are a lot of people who thought that we should get out of Iraq, including the president, mind you, the new president. And so I kind of lost my train of thought there. That's what made him angry, is that he knew McChrystal was smarter than this, and that he didn't really even believe what he was selling. And people were putting their lives on the line for that. And he understood firsthand what to some extent what these troops were going through.
For sure. Well, I mean, when Obama came in, like you were saying earlier, when he came in on a promise to refocus on Afghanistan, to expand the war on terror into Pakistan because of the various Pakistani, both state and otherwise, support for the Afghan insurgency. And I'm guessing he kind of went and asked for options. I mean, Obama is not an expert military tactician or anything, but because he'd come in saying, this is my foreign policy, I'm going to somehow deal with Afghanistan, we've got to somehow sort of bring an end to this thing. He went and asked, what are the other options? And this was one of the options they had. This is one of the folders, the war plans they had on the shelf. So, like you say, I don't think McChrystal fully believed this. Or if he believed it, he was deluding himself because he needed to, because of what he was actually trying to accomplish or whatever. The notion that McChrystal was just so dumb that he didn't see it, which is kind of how the movie portrays it in a couple of places.
Yeah, that's one of my few objections to this movie, is the way they portrayed McChrystal. But anyway, go ahead.
No, you're right. He does come across as a little bit simple-minded, whereas the real-life McChrystal, as with most senior military officers, they aren't dummies. They may have some blinkers on. They may think very much within certain paradigms that both me and you would very much dispute those paradigms, but nonetheless, they're not stupid people. They, in many respects, are half military leaders, half politicians. And like you say, McChrystal was kind of put in there to sell this, to say, we've got a new policy, we've got a new approach. Whether or not it would work, whether or not McChrystal actually believed it would work, is almost irrelevant at that point. He was there to sell it. He was there to promote it. And obviously it went horribly wrong. And, the proof is in the pudding. Here we are several years later. Is Afghanistan anywhere closer to being settled? No. We're now talking about making some kind of accommodation with the Taliban, although now there's some kind of ISIS presence in Afghanistan, which is throwing another spanner in the works. It hasn't worked, clearly. Several years later, we can easily sit here and look back and say, what we were doing 2009, 2010 didn't work.
And you have to question whether anyone ever thought it would. In Robert Gates, who is Obama, keeps him as the Secretary of Defense for a period of time. And he himself said that we're not leaving Afghanistan. And Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was part of the Bush administration, Colin Powell's chief of staff, who is now, he's changed a lot. In fact, I would say he's actually trying to make up for the fact that he was complicit in the invasion of the Iraq War. And he has a lot of insightful things to say. And recently he said numerous times that the real reason why we're in Afghanistan is, well, for one, to sort of block the new Silk Road. Sort of goes back to that heartland theory, but certainly back in this point in time, China had not yet announced their One Belt, One Road project. Now it's, full in the works. I'm sure it's been in the planning for a long time, probably our military knew, or intelligence knew about it at that time. But we're certainly there to, prevent them from expansion. He said we're also there our troops are there as a cover for CIA operations in China with the Uyghurs and, sort of fostering an insurgency. and also to be close to Pakistan because of their nukes and their fragility. Let's put it that way. So he said those are the reasons why we're really in Afghanistan and why it is an indefinite deployment. And but Americans are never ever told the real reasons why we're at war because we wouldn't support them, most likely. We're not inclined to support them, most Americans. So they also always have to come up with a narrative. And, the surge in coin was another one of those narratives.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's interesting you bring up the whole Pakistan instability nuclear situation because one of the main reasons why the Americans backed off and let Pakistan develop nukes is because we needed them to support the Mujahideen.
Oh, boy.
This is actually in the papers, this is in the documents from the early 1980s, is that India, who at that point I think were led by Indira Gandhi, and she was saying, Pakistan becoming a nuclear nation isn't a good thing, not just for India, but for the world. And they were really pushing back against this and trying to make a fuss about it. And the British and American governments basically messed them around. And some of these very, formerly highly classified documents say explicitly, this is because we need Pakistan for the Afghan operation. So we're not going to interfere with their nuclear program. We're not going to try and stop them. And so you could argue that is actually a genuine example of imperial hubris.
Yeah.
That we're now 20 or 30 years down the line having to be in Afghanistan precisely because Pakistan has nukes and Pakistan is politically unstable. And it's like, well, we created this situation in the first place, or at least we stood back and let it happen. And yet, will we ever learn that lesson? Probably not.
Apparently not. It's also, I mean, not to get back into the Charlie Wilson sport, but it's just another thing that makes it ludicrous that one congressman's pet project, is what spurred that intervention. Just,
yeah, sure.
It was much bigger than that.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll play the other Hastings clip. All right. So this is a short interview that Scott Horton had with Michael Hastings on the night. It was right after the Runaway General article had been published. And he's actually in Kandahar, and he says he's getting out of there, which I would have hightailed it out of there too. But I guess he had planned on leaving anyway. But it's just really interesting that he was still in Afghanistan when this thing got published. And I think he said later he didn't expect this kind of reaction to it. But there's a lot of reasons why it was reacted to this way. Anyway, here's that clip. It is June 23rd, 2010.
Let's talk about, first of all, I guess the reaction to your piece. You have General McChrystal and his Team America, his closest buddies surrounding him, really opening up about how much they cannot stand the administration. And that seems to have been the thing that got Washington all upset.
Yeah, apparently to criticize and make fun of the vice president in front of a reporter, that's generally probably like a good career move. But I think what some of the what the comments point to from General McChrystal's view is a real frustration that his team has with the White House, as well as a frustration they had with other civilian policymakers who are involved in the Afghanistan strategy.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what comes across in the article is that it's not a personal account, really, of McChrystal. It's about his inability to succeed in Afghanistan, and then it seems like all the frustration, all the finger pointing goes up from there, instead of them taking responsibility, him and his Team America.
Yeah, and I think certainly if we look at, President Obama's role in sort of selecting General McChrystal, why he selects General McChrystal, and what President Obama's strategy for Afghanistan originally was. Remember, in March 2009, President Obama said he wanted to narrow the gains and the goals in Afghanistan, narrow them to just fighting al-Qaeda. Then he selected a general who proceeded to do just the opposite and expand the goals almost exponentially. We went from 50,000 troops to 150,000 troops. We went from fighting al-Qaeda to building a nation on an almost unprecedented scale.
So really, I think, part of the story is the relationship between the president and the general, and the fact that the president has just sort of lost control of the policy.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't sound like the troops in Afghanistan seem to be so gung-ho about this anymore either.
No, I think, I'm sure you've discussed counterinsurgency many times on your program. We've discussed it before as well. The U.S. military is made to fight. That's what they're really good at, and they're really efficient at it. And it's very difficult to put them in situations and then tell them, don't fight. And that rubs a lot of them the wrong way, and a lot of them feel that they may have to make sacrifices, and they might be putting their own lives more at risk rather than, say, killing who they view are insurgents.
And that's an interesting thing, too, the whole, sent out there to fight with one hand tied behind their back. They're up against people who have rifles and are willing to shoot back at them, and yet, because they're supposed to be trying to avoid civilian casualties, even though all their enemies are civilians, they're put in a position where they have to get shot rather than shoot.
No, I think, the sort of fundamental flaw with counterinsurgency is that, we spend $600 billion a year in our military, but then we get involved in these wars where we can't even use our technological edge. In a way, it doesn't make much sense. Once you take away the U.S. and the ground troops air support, you're putting a U.S. soldier on, a somewhat level playing field with a Taliban fighter. And so these guys who signed up to fight are like, what the hell? Why are we here?
Well, now, you talk about how they changed the mission from fighting al-Qaeda to building a nation, and how McChrystal's got his stamp on it. And I guess they had to change the mission because he says in here, there are no al-Qaeda in Afghanistan.
Yeah, no, exactly. The sort of connection between nation building and fighting terrorism, and certainly fighting al-Qaeda is, I think, a very tenuous connection at best. And so you get stuck with this momentum of the campaign you're fighting. And it's worse than a quagmire, as I say in the story. It's worse than a quagmire because it's a quagmire we knowingly walked into. Because if al-Qaeda is in Pakistan, then what are we doing in Afghanistan?
It seems like there is, a challenge to the civilian supremacy in a sense here. You have a very powerful general mocking and ridiculing the president, the vice president, the special envoy, the ambassador, everybody but the Secretary of State, apparently. He thinks he's better than them, and that's really not how it's supposed to be in America. Did you take that as a real challenge to civilian supremacy, or is just some drunk old generals letting off some steam here?
I think there's a larger kind of structural issue here about, you just compare the DOD budget to the State Department budget, $600 billion to $50 billion. You looked at every foreign service officer, there's more people in the Army band than there are foreign service officers. You could fit every foreign service officer on an aircraft carrier. So you look like just the sort of decay of the State Department, and basically our foreign policy has become our defense policy. The two are one. And I think that translates, into the fact that a lot of the time, the leaders get the blame for all the wars, as they should take their fair share of blame. But I think we also have to start looking at the military leaders in a much more critical way than they're accustomed to be looking at.
So there's a lot packed into that excerpt of one already short interview, and I took only about half of it. So there's a lot going on here. And that thing that he says at the end, that, we have to hold military officers accountable. At that point in time, and I would say maybe still, you're kind of not allowed to do that here. You're not allowed to, you have to, put out your flag and salute and, thank them for their service. You're really not supposed to criticize them. So that's part of it, but it's not all of it. He's talking about this internal battle that's going on between the Obama administration and certainly the neocon foreign policy part of the military, where they've taken advantage of Obama's intent to focus more on Afghanistan, and they're operating at a time when there's a lot of anti-war sentiment, and they basically manipulate Obama into doing a much larger surge than he ever intended. So he's angry about that. He's getting these challenges, and they're actually doing this in public too. Like Petraeus is making statements in public, and McChrystal. I mean, I'm not sure of this. Who leaked McChrystal's report? That's mentioned in the movie. It's implied that he did, right?
Oh, it's heavily implied that he did. I'm not actually sure myself. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember reading stuff saying that it seems to have been McChrystal, but I've never seen any actual, like, any confession or any witness or anything that would be anything like definitive. So yeah, I'm not sure.
So you've got that going on. And then there's one piece, I've never heard this before, but when I talked to Scott Horton the other night, he said that, and I don't recall what his source was, but apparently at least one of the things, maybe the overarching thing, the reason why Obama actually fired McChrystal was because he was so alarmed at the insubordination and the frustration of the troops that this article revealed. That was a huge concern of his. So I never heard that aspect before. I found that interesting.
What? So that rather than this being any great failure on McChrystal's part, or just because McChrystal was kind of a stubborn bastard who wasn't really doing what he was told to do, that this was more about it was causing such a morale problem within the troops themselves that something had to give, and therefore the obvious thing was sack McChrystal and replace him with someone else. Yeah, I mean, I can believe that.
Yeah. I kind of don't buy the fact that that was the only thing, the only reason why. I think it was probably Obama and Biden just incredibly insulted by some military officers who they were already doing internal battles with. And Obama is at this point in time, we don't see him this way anymore, but at this point in time, he was definitely seen as more of the not exactly anti-war, but definitely not all in with he was going to get us out of wars. He wasn't going to escalate them. We now know that Obama is not the peacenik that he was seen as. He didn't exactly say he was peacenik, but he definitely made political hay out of the fact that he opposed the Iraq invasion before he had to vote on it in the Senate, mind you. And, he's much more of a war president than anyone anticipated, let's just to put it lightly.
For sure. Well, and you've got to remember, Hillary Clinton tried to play that card in that election as well. She tried to make out that she was not a hawk, that she was in some way, recognized that Iraq was a mistake. And as I recall, she voted for it.
She did.
And I think that was more just that was what the Democrats, that was their effort on foreign policy. That was how they were going to try and win that election, no matter who their candidate was to say, look, the Bush administration has screwed up foreign policy. We're stuck in these two wars that don't seem to be anywhere near ending. So we're going to do something differently. We're not going to start any new wars, and we're going to try and prosecute these existing wars in a different way. And it's mostly nonsense. I mean, there were some changes, I guess, in policy and tactics, but nothing fundamental. And of course, those two, they were the architects behind Libya. They were also deeply involved in getting the US so involved in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, the notion of either of those two as kind of peace presidents is nonsense. But then, there's a long history of this. Woodrow Wilson got re-elected promising to not take America into World War I. And then, 2 months after getting inaugurated or whatever, he declares war on Germany.
Yeah.
So, it's a long-standing game, this one, of course. But certainly, yeah, it's an interesting point. Who is ultimately responsible? Who needs to be held accountable? Is it the civilian part of the government or is it the military? And indeed, how do you hold the military part of government accountable? Because you can sack them.
Yeah.
You can sack a general here and replace him with another one, but it's not like they're getting prosecuted. It's not like they're having to pay reparations or anything. So ultimately, the military gets given orders by the White House. I mean, usually the White House gives the military the orders selected from the three options that the Pentagon presented them with, all of which, on closer examination, are basically the same option. But nonetheless, they get given their orders, but everything after that, how they actually go about doing this stuff, is essentially up to them. It's not like the White House is an expert, has expertise in military strategy. They're just there to say, we need a new policy. And the Pentagon says, well, we can do this or this. And the White House says, okay, do the first one. And then they go away and do it. But how they actually do it is almost entirely up to them, because the Pentagon is kind of a self-contained state within a state. So the notion of holding them accountable, while utterly vital, if you're actually going to try and maintain any notion of America being a sort of democratic nation or anything, is kind of laughable at this point in time. The Pentagon, they don't just do whatever they like, but who's going to stop them? If they do, when it comes down to a battle between the Pentagon and the White House, there's only one winner, really.
Yeah, and there really is a vast war machine, which is, what they titled this movie. But I guess the other thing that McChrystal's frustrated, and he's on board with the surge and the coin narrative. But it is portrayed specifically that he had, personal ambition was definitely part of it too. Like he wanted his trophy. He wanted to go after Helmand province, and that they put that all on him. And I assume that's somewhat accurate, because I haven't heard anyone challenge the things that Hastings has put forward in this book. And although there probably are challenges that I haven't come across, but maybe, I'm told that the movie is pretty faithful to the book. So, although like you said, they've made it into a satire, sort of a black comedy. So certain things are going to be exaggerated, just like a cartoonist would do. And they definitely do that with McChrystal, but I don't think they would, fabricate something of his ambition to go after Helmand province. So there was, a bit of the no one else has ever won here, and we're going to be the first ones. And in fact, in the movie, McChrystal actually ridicules his British partner, an advisor, or part of the chain of command, I guess. He actually mocks him, makes something like, well, you guys weren't able to do this, so we're going to do the job. We're going to take.
Yeah, we've been brought in to do the job that you couldn't do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't really doubt that is a factor. I mean, it's not the only thing going on here, but it's certainly a factor, because let's face it, how else do you become a general at the Pentagon if you're not ambitious and if you're not a kind of intelligent, somewhat scheming kind of person? So the notion that that's who McChrystal was, well, obviously he wouldn't have been in that position if he wasn't. So, I certainly buy into that as a major factor in this. And there probably was a certain amount of ego battle between him and Obama, just on like a personal basis. I don't want to reduce it to that, and I'm certainly not trying to reduce it to that. But, they're both ambitious, intelligent people who want to make names for themselves and want to go down in history. When their two relative ambitions come into conflict, like I say, it's going to happen. People like that are going to have some kind of ego battle, let alone all of the other stuff in terms of the kind of institutional pressures to keep a presence in Afghanistan for as long as possible, not just for geostrategic purposes, but also for military industrial purposes as well. And if you're struggling against that, I mean, this is the joke, of course, is that it's entirely possible that Obama did believe this could work, or at least hoped it could work. McChrystal didn't, but that didn't make a huge amount of difference anyway, because other factors and other pressures were being brought to bear that meant it was never going to work regardless of who believed in it or who didn't. The facts on the ground were what they were. So, a real messy situation, a real messy one, and a complex one to understand. I mean, the film, it is a 2-hour movie. They've got to compress and simplify some things in order to get it down to 2 hours. I understand that much. But I think the dialogue does actually incorporate most of these different elements at different points. Yeah, it doesn't suggest there is just one thing going on here. It says, this is a complex scenario with a bunch of different factors, part of which is personal ego and so on, but part of it which is also the situation in Afghanistan, the institutional pressures within America, and so on.
Yeah, I think that may be part of the reason why they made it a black comedy, although that might just have been sort of the whim that Brad Pitt had at that time, because there were others. I think he did at least one other black comedy around in the movies. Now I'm not going to remember the name. I'm not that good at remembering movies, to be honest with you. But
No,
didn't he do
sure. I mean,
the
one
other
thing
one?
that it did remind me of, the film does remind me of a little bit, is The Men Who Stare at Goats. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I did see that.
But it's because it is like, how do you make a somewhat critical movie about war, and especially about war in a place like Afghanistan? If you made that just a kind of dry drama, it would probably just be really depressing and no one would want to watch it. And you'd kind of be wasting your time. The only way to get people to watch something like this is to give them some kind of entertainment factor, and humor is the obvious thing to do because the whole situation is so absurd that it lends itself to humor.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very good point. And it's also, you know, for time immemorial, it's a subversive technique too, isn't it?
Oh, of course, because people will be far more accepting of something that makes them laugh, or at least willing to consider it if it makes them laugh, than if they're just told this is a criticism of the Afghanistan
Yeah.
war. I mean, if you want to make a film like that, you make a PBS documentary. And interestingly enough, there was a PBS documentary called Afghanistan: The Surge, which was made in cooperation with the Pentagon. But when they saw the rough cut of it, when the Pentagon saw the rough cut, they said, no, you've basically painted this whole thing as hopeless and futile, and you have to re-edit your documentary to remove that element. So they did. So this is clearly something from a media point of view, from a public perception point of view, that the DoD really does care about. They didn't want people coming away with the impression that they will come away with if they watch War Machine. And just from a production standpoint, because, you know, this is kind of my whole area, War Machine was made without any assistance from the Pentagon, kind of obviously if you've watched the film. But so if you're wondering where did all those military vehicles and what have you come from, the helicopters and Humvees and what have you, most of it actually came from the United Arab Emirates. Their military
Really?
they're credited at the end of the film. And this is a kind of interesting development that's happened in the last few years, is that up until maybe 2010 or so, if you needed this stuff, you could either go to a big European military, British, French, Spanish, whoever, or you could go to the American military, the Pentagon. Now you can go to the Vietnamese military, the Korean military, United Arab Emirates, Saudis, wherever. So if your film is somewhat critical of the West, or at least Western foreign policy, and therefore you can't get the British or American militaries to support your movie without butchering it, you now have this extra option. And hence you're getting films like War Machine, or you'll probably laugh and think this is stupid, but the most recent King Kong movie is actually set in the Vietnam War and it's kind of got elements of Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now in it. It's a kind of a homage to Apocalypse Now, but made as a King Kong movie. And it's very, very critical of the Vietnam War. And I was wondering, watching this, well, okay, so where did they get all the military hardware from? And then I saw at the end, it was made with the cooperation of the Vietnamese military.
Oh my gosh.
Who no wonder would be like, oh yeah, you're making a film critical of the Vietnam War. Yeah, sure, you can borrow some helicopters. You can go right ahead. So it's interesting that, you know, the political balance in Hollywood is shifting slowly but surely, because you now have the option of other governments you can go to get this kind of support. And therefore you don't have to submit to the Pentagon. You don't have to submit to the CIA like Charlie Wilson's War did. You can actually go and make a movie that's got the same kind of production values as Black Hawk Down or whatever, but without the political compromise. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, and also you've got an unpopular conservative president in office too. If a Democrat gets back in there, then we're going to go back to being difficult to criticize. So, and it's a silver lining maybe.
Well, Trump does present a lot of opportunities for people.
Yeah.
Not just comedians as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are reasons to be cheerful about the Trump presidency, I guess, sort of.
I look for silver linings because, God, what else can we do? Oh, I was going to say that at this point in time in 2010, I think everybody pretty much knew that we weren't going to win these wars, right? So, like Scott and calls it the surge or the counterinsurgency Kool-Aid. So I don't even remember where I was going to go with that. I got so interested in what you were saying, I lost my train of thought. Oh well, if it was important, it'll come back to me. Oh, I do. I know what I was going to say. Another point I was going to make, which is when at the time of that interview, I don't think McChrystal had been fired yet, right? There was like a day or two in between because he went right back to Washington, and Obama said he wasn't going to make a decision until he actually talked to McChrystal. I don't get the impression that Obama actually disliked McChrystal, but you have to remember that. Oh, but he did I think it was Rose Garden. He did a big speech when he fired McChrystal because it was a big deal. It's a big deal to fire a general, a commanding general, during a war. But he does mention it's sort of a cryptic speech that he gives. And by the way, he's got with him standing up at the podium because of course Obama is fighting against the what every sort of liberal president worries about is that they're going to be portrayed as weak or cut and run and all the tactics that get used against them. So he's got Biden with him. He's got Gates, his Secretary of Defense, with him. He's got Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he's got Petraeus, all standing there at the podium with him. And he does mention that the whole civilian command point. So that was clearly important enough to make it very explicit in this speech. He also compliments McChrystal, which you would expect. He doesn't rail against him, which wouldn't be a good idea anyway. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other thing is that, again, some context. McChrystal is coming off of, I don't know how many years at this point, 8 years maybe, of intense war fighting. He hasn't been at home very much at all. He's been commanding general in the special operations forces. He's involved in some really nasty stuff, detainees of torture and the whole Iraq war. It was intense, right? And you have to wonder if I don't know if you should leave a general in that kind of a position. I think he wasn't even a general. I think he actually maybe he was a lower level general. I think he didn't make 4-star until he took command in Afghanistan, if I remember correctly.
I think so.
But
yeah.
what is his psychological condition right now? First of all, he's been in this intense war, a very crazy war for all these years, and then he gets the full command of Afghanistan. But also, it's a complete switch. He's a special operations forces general for all those years, and then he gets switched over to becoming a conventional forces general in command of a whole war in a country. So, I would say that should be a factor, that you should think about when you're thinking about the McChrystal situation. And
No, sure. In terms of passing this out and exactly what happened there or whose fault which parts of it were, and so on, I agree with you. I mean, and I think the portrait of him in War Machine is quite accurate. This is a guy who did just, he slept wherever the grunts slept. He didn't see him. He didn't want to come across as some kind of elitist or whatever. And even just spending a 2-year tour doing that is stressful and traumatic enough. Plenty of people who come back from a 2-year tour of Iraq are pretty messed up, let alone someone who spent several years running special operations forces, which are, I mean, a lot of them are effectively just death squads, for one thing. But also the nature of the operations is very intense and very difficult and extremely stressful. That's why they put special operations people through such tough training, is because if you can't make it through the training, you're not going to be able to make it through the operations. So you have all of that going on. You have the fact that The guy is probably suffering mentally and emotionally at that point, if only because, he's away from his home and his wife and everything. If for no other reason than that, but probably also for other reasons too. And then you have this fish out of water situation where, like you say, he's plucked out from running special ops in Iraq and shoved into, well, you're now the commander in, the general command of all the forces in Afghanistan, and we're going to dump another 30 or 40,000 troops in on top of that. And you're somehow supposed to adapt these techniques of special operations warfare, which is carried out with, very small numbers of people, to a full-scale, high-intensity conflict involving tens, if not hundreds of thousands of troops. It's no surprise. Again, it's just no surprise it didn't work out, is it?
No, it's not. And the other thing, and I'm actually gaining more and more respect for this movie as we analyze it and talk about it, because in a short period of time, they touch on a lot of really important aspects of it. Like, they do give you a sense that McChrystal has PTSD in his behavior in period of time, in his interaction with his wife and so on.
Well, one other thing just that I'd like to bring up from a production and industrial perspective is that, of course, this movie came out on Netflix, and I can't imagine a conventional TV network, with the possible exception of HBO, but otherwise can't see a conventional TV network picking up a movie like this and putting money behind it, nor can I see a conventional movie studio doing that. So, again, some credit is due to Netflix for shifting the balance a little bit. They have made the fringes of the mainstream more popular, if you like. They've provided a place for all of those fringe people to go and watch the sorts of things that they like. And that's, again, it's a good thing, because let's face it, most of our entertainment is produced within pretty narrow parameters in terms of what they will cover, what sorts of films they will make, and how they will cover these things. So to see a movie like this, which is not perfect at all, it does have some flaws, but it is also a pretty good, hard-hitting, nonetheless entertaining movie. It has a lot of different elements they got right. And I think, while the McChrystal character is a bit simplified, like we were saying, the overall narrative is fairly subtle. And one, just probably my favorite element of the entire movie is, of course, Hamid Karzai, played by Ben Kingsley.
Oh my gosh.
Who
he
I just
nailed
found...
that. He nailed it.
He is Hamid Karzai. He fits, everything I've read about that guy, every time I've seen, any footage of him or anything, it's just like, yeah, I'm sure Ben Kingsley just sat down and read all this same stuff and looked at this stuff and yeah, I'm going to have some fun with this one. But I felt that was very accurate as well. And I liked how they incorporated that element, that they said, McChrystal did go to Karzai and try and get him on board with this. And Karzai was just not taking any of this seriously. He's, it's all theatre. He says, I thank you for including me in the theatre of all of this. And I thought, that's what the movie does well, because those scenes are very funny, but they're also very apt, and they do tell you something, and something real about a real situation. And if a movie can do all of those things, it's doing pretty well, I think.
Yeah, it is. It does show the brilliance of it. Maybe it's subtle, but yeah, the more you think about it, the more brilliant it is that in a short period of time they were able to just do these little things that that become almost a meme for a much bigger point. And I think they succeed in that. The other thing I was going to say, two things, and I wrote it down this time. Okay. The other thing, and they also portrayed this in, with really just a few scenes, but the commander of also Iraq, but especially Afghanistan, maybe, he's known for his hands-on. The people who serve under him love him. McChrystal, I'm talking about. He's a sort of a soldier or whatever. And I actually know someone close to me who knows him from his time in West Point. And this person, keeps in touch with they may not have been military. Some of them, were career military. Others just served their 5 years and went into something else. But this person knew McChrystal in West Point a lot of years ago. but he specifically made a point of saying he was not an asshole. He was not a jerk, and he was sort of kind and fair to to the first year cadets who basically get harassed for the whole year, and they're assigned mentors and some military term for it that I'm not familiar with, but that he was actually a pretty good guy. Now, people can change across over the years, especially after fighting wars and all that. So there's that about him, and he's worked with special operations forces, which you probably get more interaction with your force because it's a smaller number. Now he's got large amounts of troops, but also he's the coalition there is what, like 43 countries, and they give you that sense when he wants to change the office and he goes around to like the person from, I don't remember, Estonia or something, somebody who's got like 10 token troops in Afghanistan, and he like and then he's got to manage Karzai, and then he's got the diplomat who's he's not got a good relationship with him, which that gives you a sense of this tug of war between, or the struggle between the military and the civilians and the diplomats. So, I mean, how much time did he actually have to run a war if he's got to do all these things?
Well, that's the thing that I think, and I think the movie did this very well in portraying all of these different kind of elements tugging on his attention and occupying his time. We don't actually see him carrying out the war. You have that, in the third act, it does go a bit Full Metal Jacket, and you actually have some guys on the ground and they're, running around and shooting and what have you.
Well, he travels the whole country too, right? He goes out and he tries to see what's actually happening for himself.
But in terms of actually giving orders and carrying out the war, there's very, very little of that in the film.
Yeah.
Most of his time is occupied dealing with different people trying to pull him in different directions or causing him problems. And in some ways, he comes across as fairly sympathetic. Like you say, he doesn't come across as someone you hate. He comes across as someone who was kind of given an impossible job, and regardless of who he was, it was going to be an impossible job. And then you get, obviously, the callback at the end of the film where McChrystal gets fired and they bring in the new guy, who's kind of, just McChrystal, but again, another.
Petraeus,
Yeah, sure. It's the same but different kind of thing.
Yeah, they do.
And okay, that's kind of a cheap cinematic trick in some respects, but how else are you going to end that movie? But they're right. Whoever they parachuted in there at that point in time was just they were probably going to do exactly what McChrystal did, to be honest, because what else could they have done? And so that begs the question, that poses that the question that Scott and Michael Hastings were talking about in that second clip that you played of, well, should we actually be here? If it makes no difference who we put in charge or which strategy we adopt or whether we have more troops, less troops, more here, less there, whatever, if none of that really makes much difference, why not just, I don't want to use the term cut and run, but why not at least ask the question of, well, if this war can't be won, why bother fighting it?
Yeah, and at that point in time, there were a lot of people asking that. And I believe the British officer, I think I heard, don't quote me on this, maybe I shouldn't put it in here, but his advice was actually to pull what troops they had out of Helmand, and then McChrystal surged forward with it. Just crazy, right?
No, he said, we can't win Helmand, and it's strategically insignificant anyway, since there's hardly anyone there. So why not just cut it loose and focus on other areas? But even that much, even saying part of the country, we can't win the war, was unthinkable.
Yeah, it was crazy.
You're not going to get a general going back to the White House and saying that as their recommendation, are you? And because of that, like I say, what else could McChrystal really have done? And I don't want to sympathize with the guy too much, but, just on a basic human level, you've got to think, well, if I was in that position, I'm not sure what the hell I would have done differently. So,
I think they actually do a pretty good job of allowing you to sympathize a little bit, but not entirely, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and then here's a question for you. This is one of my criticisms, but I may have missed. I'm infamous for missing parts of movies that I don't remember. I have to watch them multiple times to remember all of it. But I think it is accurate to say that when he put Petraeus in there to replace McChrystal, who he just fired,
Hmm.
that was a demotion, and it was a punishment, and it was a humiliation. But I don't think the movie portrayed that. I think they left that out altogether. And the guy that they had storming into the airport, just like the scene in the beginning of McChrystal walking through the airport, like he didn't even resemble Petraeus at all. Petraeus is much more frail and he's sort of hunched over. I mean, he's supposed to be a great athlete and all that, but he kind of doesn't look like one when you see him. But they sort of skipped that whole line of, you know, this conflict between Obama and Petraeus, and you know, it played out much further beyond Petraeus, you know, being demoted and put in command of the war in Afghanistan. You know, and he was the one who was selling this great strategy. We have to stay and we're going to use the surge, and the surge was successful and the surge is great. And Obama was kind of like, okay, then you go do it. Let's see you do it. And what I'm told is that Petraeus didn't even he changed strategies. He didn't even really use his counterinsurgency strategy that he was famous for when he was actually in charge of Afghanistan, which is interesting.
No, you're right. In the film, they don't really say anything about Petraeus. I mean, he isn't called Petraeus, just like McChrystal isn't actually called McChrystal. It's clear who they are, but they use fictional names, presumably so they don't get sued. But no, they don't really mention anything about it. He is just McChrystal's replacement, and that's all we really know. But you're right, Petraeus was, in effect, demoted. I mean, it's kind of absurd to think that being put in charge of the forces in Afghanistan is a demotion, but it was. And yeah, I mean, again, going back to those clips that you played, what is counterinsurgency from a military point of view? What do you actually do when you're on the ground? Well, basically, you go out there and you wait for them to shoot at you. Because if you're not allowed to proactively, aggressively just go and shoot people because you're being told don't kill civilians, you have to wait for the insurgents to attack you in order to fight back, in order to
and
even
you can't
identify.
tell who they are. You can't
and
tell,
you can't tell who yeah, you can't tell who they are until they start shooting at you, and by that point you've been shot. So yeah, I mean, military counterinsurgency doesn't really work. It hasn't really worked anywhere. The only way it ever works is with a lot of intelligence. If you can get spies inside the insurgency and identify leadership and then, I don't know, direct them into ambushes or assassinate them or something, then maybe you'll get somewhere. And there are occasions, like with the British and the Mau Mau in Kenya in the 1950s, 1960s, or the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines in the 50s, which Ed Lansdale, the famous CIA and Air Force guy, Ed Lansdale, he ran what was called a pseudo-gang or counter-gang strategy, which is very much intelligence-based rather than military-based. It's essentially where you create your own fake insurgent gang and use that to infiltrate the real insurgency. That can work, sort of, a bit. Military counterinsurgency, it's exactly how it looks like in the film. You basically sent a bunch of grunts out there, and when someone starts shooting at them, they either shoot back or try and capture them. But you can't win a war that way.
Yeah,
I mean yeah. This is why it didn't work when the Soviets tried it, for heaven's sake. I mean, we are essentially just repeating what the Soviets did in the 80s, but worse.
Yeah, I mean, with both of these movies, the second time I watched them, is just, again, the irony is just kind of overwhelming.
Yeah.
I have one last question for you, and that is, I don't know a whole lot about the production of this movie, but the fact that it was not put out in theaters, did they have a hard time getting it through the full distribution? Like, did they have to sort of do this on the sly? And, did they think that by releasing it on Netflix would sort of reduce the number of people who would watch it? Because this just came out, like a year and a half ago. So by that point in time, they realized that Netflix has probably a bigger distribution than people who see it in the theaters now. Like, was that sort of like not understanding the latest, social media and streaming and all that, or do you think they intended to go for the Netflix audience?
From what I understand, they did try and sell this script the conventional way, where you go and try and sell it to a studio and they will strike some distribution deal to get it in movie theaters, but none of them were interested.
Hmm.
And so as a result, they ended up with Netflix almost by default, because I mean, lots of TV shows and films have gone this way in recent years. Is if you're too controversial or unpredictable or whatever it is that's wrong with your script, that means that those horrible corporate committees in Hollywood take a look at it and go, no. Where else do you go? You go to Amazon or Hulu or Netflix, or maybe you'll find some small studio willing to take a risk, but then you'll have to do it for half the budget and you probably won't end up making any money anyway. Whereas at least with Netflix, you can strike a deal where they're handling all of the distribution. So you know upfront what is the distribution deal going to be. You are guaranteed a certain audience. I mean, let's face it, lots of movies get released and they only get put out in a few dozen theaters across the whole of the US.
Yeah.
You have a bigger audience on Netflix with its 137 million subscribers or whatever it's got now, than you will going a small studio, small, limited distribution route. Okay, you'll get it into some festivals and a few movie theaters, but ultimately it'll get seen by more people if it's on a streaming service. So I think that's largely for industrial reasons, that the big studios in Hollywood wouldn't make a film like this. The small studios don't really know how to market something like this to make it profitable. So by default, Netflix is kind of the last one standing.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you try to deliberately suppress a film by not, by either giving it a small distribution or it only makes it out into the art house, independent film theaters and all that, that's not such a disadvantage anymore because of Netflix, I would say.
Well, sure, because after your brief distribution run in the festivals and art house theaters, Netflix will buy you up anyway. But yeah, I don't think that this was anything kind of intentional on the part of the filmmakers. I think this is just where they ended up, because that's where the industry is at the moment, that there isn't really another way of doing it. And I strongly recommend I mean, I know a few screenwriters and things, and we all agree, there's very little chance of getting this into a mainstream TV network or movie studio. But there is now another option that's just as big, has just as much money, can produce things with the same quality of production value and so on. So there is another way to get these things made now. And that's a good thing. Like I say, I mean, I'm not a massive fan of Netflix as a corporation, but, they do make some stuff that no one else would. And for that, I think they deserve some respect.
Yeah, I agree with you. On that wholly. I've kept you a really long time. So,
Sure.
But I want to make sure that if there are any other points you wanted to make or anything else you wanted to say, that you get a chance to do that. So, please do.
No, I mean, it's all right. I honestly can't think of anything. We've been talking for 2 hours and we've covered most of what I had in my head beforehand.
We beat this thing to death.
Yeah.
So Tom, tell us where we can find your work and how people can find you and how they can support you.
Sure. Well, I mean, my main site is spyculture.com, which it's essentially my research archive into the whole realm of government involvement in the entertainment industry. I've been gathering thousands of documents, mostly through Freedom of Information requests, over the last, 5 years or so. I published a book, or co-published a book last year called National Security Cinema, where we get into dozens of examples of how movies and TV shows have been rewritten by government agencies. So if you want to know more about that,
I must read that. Yeah.
Yeah, please do get a copy. So you can support me that way, or you can support me via my Patreon. I have a Patreon campaign, or whatever you call it, which there's links to on my site, spyculture.com. And if you just want to hear more of my work, more of what I get up to and think about, I do a podcast pretty much every week called Clandestine, which you can also find on the site. So yeah, check it out, spyculture.com.
And I highly recommend. I love them myself. Okay, then. Well, again, thank you so much. And it was great talking to you, and I hope that we can find another reason to do it again.
Yeah, so do I. I've had a lot of fun.
And that's our show. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Tom Secker. Find Tom's work and ways to support that work at spyculture.com and also patreon.com/Tom Secker. The Around the Empire podcast is independent media, and it's brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in at patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire or by doing one-time donations on our website, AroundTheEmpire.com. Follow us on Twitter at AroundTheEmpire. Follow me at Joanne Leon. It helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, and that's free. The channel's growing, but we haven't yet reached the required number of subscribers needed for revenue and for the Super Chat feature. Also, if you would, use the thumbs up icon to like the videos, the individual videos. We appreciate that. Subscribe to our podcast on your preferred podcast app. We're on most of them now. We're on iTunes, Apple Podcast, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, and others. And if you like the podcast, take a minute, leave a nice review. It helps. We also have a page on Facebook. See you next time. Take care, everyone.